Hi everyone, I'm Tanya, and welcome to another edition of the Internationalist. Today we are joined by Nihal, who's an Egyptian independent researcher and writer, currently residing in London. She's written and conducted research on the Middle East and North Africa on issues spanning political economy, geopolitics, literature, and more. Thank you for joining us, Nihal.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
In today's discussion, Nihal and I'll delve into contemporary economic issues faced by Egypt, the ongoing genocide of Palestinian people, and on Nihal's own work, including her music. To start with, Nihal, the first question that I wanted to pose to you was about the policy choices or governance decisions during Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's time in power, which seem to have played a role in Egypt's economic difficulties. How do these economic issues intersect then with the larger socio-political landscape in Egypt, particularly under Sisi's leadership?
Yeah, this is a really good and complex question. Um, Egypt is currently facing an unprecedented economic crisis with the pound extremely devalued. I think today's rate is $1 equals 40 Egyptian pounds, which is something we've never seen before. We're experiencing price hikes and record high historic inflation. Um, and to explain this, we can explain this through three ways. Firstly, Egypt's own economic decisions since President Abdel Fattah Sisi took hold. So, of course, Egypt um, has already taken loans from the IMF and the World Bank prior to President Abdel Fattah Sisi's presidency. But since Sisi took over in 2014, that same year, 2014, Egypt um, had its own austerity program that is separate from the conditionalities set out against it by the IMF. So the first reason we can point that to is to the government's own decisions separate from international financial institutions. So it is really a political choice. Secondly, of course, and as I've mentioned, um, Sisi, following a trajectory that was started by Anwar Sadat, the successor of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who started Egypt's open door policy or infitah. And with it, he made he guaranteed the involvement of the US and the West through involving the IMF in Egypt's economy. In 1977, famously, the bread riots happened when Sadat took Egypt's first loan from the IMF and followed the IMF's conditions in trying to remove subsidies off of bread, which resulted in an uprising in Egypt that saw hundreds of people jailed. Later, he rolled back these cuts on subsidies, but then decided to slowly cut subsidies over years rather than cut it suddenly. So he started this. Mubarak continued this trajectory. Um, and obviously the revolution happened, but then there was a counter revolution in 2013 as Sisi headed a coup that saw um, Muhammad Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, ousted. And then in 2014, this trajectory continued. And we saw Egypt take out an IMF loan in 2016 that saw the pound devalued. And then there was a brief period when Egypt's economy was fine for 2 years until Egypt had to repay the loan, obviously. In order to do so, it took loans from everyone, including famously the Gulf states, Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And now we can see that The UAE, for example, owns the most real estate in Egypt, more than any other organization or anyone else or any company. Um, and through that, we see that Egypt has lost a lot of its sovereignty, as it has um, it has to repay back its loans, and it's, according to Bloomberg, is the second country most likely to declare bankruptcy next year after Ukraine. And Ukraine, obviously, we know, has a wartime economy. We saw Egypt impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war, as it imports 90% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, um, and a really remarkably high percentage, and how it came to be that dependent, and that it slowly became an economy dependent on imports. So, for example, Egypt produces the produce that Egypt produces the most is citrus stuff like oranges, lemons, strawberries, that kind of thing, and it is to fill the gaps in the global market, acting in its role as a periphery economy. So, for example, we see Egypt boasts about being the largest exporter of oranges, but who does that serve? Producing oranges is very labor intensive and water intensive. So it's clearly not for the sake of self sufficiency. It is to play its role as a periphery market to serve the global economy under capitalism. And of course, the third point is that the military's involvement in the economy is extremely significant part of this, because the military has its own economy, um, buys real estate, has factories, and so on and so forth. Of course, a lot of the liberal observers say that this is the number one reason why Egypt's economy is suffering. I don't necessarily agree, because let's say the military stops interfering in the economy. The ensuing result is that, this would encourage free market economics, which we know doesn't really work in improving third world economies. And yeah, hope this is clear. It's a bit of a complex situation.
No.
Continuing with the Egypt example, we find that Western countries do something else entirely, is that they dangle debt relief as a weapon or as a tool in order to achieve foreign policy objectives in, global South countries. So, for example, um, half of Egypt's foreign debt was wiped out when the U.S. convinced Egypt to join to join the first Gulf War in 1991, um, against, obviously, and on the side of Kuwait against Iraq. And then, that follows the precedent of also, wiping some of Egypt's debt when it signed the Camp David Accords, and, you know, giving it a higher credit score, etc., etc. And we saw even recently during Israel's war on Gaza that this possibility of using Egypt's debt crisis, we saw, rumors, I mean, unsubstantiated rumors that wiping half of Egypt's foreign debt was offered in exchange for Egypt taking Palestinian refugees in Sinai. Um, so, yeah, I think it is in Western countries' interests to see countries of the global South, um, lose some of their sovereignty because they're not economically strong and are dependent on international financial institutions that are propped up by the US and Europe.
Yeah, that's true. And you've written a lot about what's happening in Palestine right now, I think. And only recently also I've been reading about India's support to Israel is on a global stage, and the whole world is watching right now. And it's quite shapeful, I think, even the way the country has taken a stance on ceasefire, or even the way it has promised 100,000 laborers from India to Israel. Um, I, I mean, I can't even begin to sort of unpack how history will treat this stance, but and it's just also the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people internationally, and also I see this in India. It's being sort of posited as Israel's war on Hamas, despite the fact that there has been decades long erasure of Palestinians, their rights, their homes, everything. And you know what would you think, like, do you have any insights into the deeper implications of this deliberate erasure which I see in media everywhere, and how international community can then address this challenge facing Palestinians, they've been faced for decades, both in the context of their immediate suffering and the erasure of their identity through settler colonialism by Israel?
Yeah, I mean, recently we've seen thousands in the global south and in the global north, hundreds of thousands, millions even, march in the streets, saying, in our thousands, in our millions, we're all Palestinians, um, in something that is not unlike, in a show of support that is not unlike, opposing the war in Iraq, opposing the war in Vietnam, kind of like a universal humanism. And obviously, that is at odds with how Western global elites and Western controlled media frames Israel's war in Gaza now. So I think as internationalists and as leftists, we need to always contextualize Palestine as an anti-imperialist and as an international struggle. Um, when it comes to discussing Palestine, you can adopt either an idealist analysis or a materialist analysis. And the idealist analysis is largely the one we see used by Western media and liberal observers, which is in fact pushed by the Zionist state, that it's an age-old conflict, that the primary motivator for the conflict is religion, that the way to overcome this is, always to dissolve whatever party it is that's running Palestine, or get both sides in the room, etc., etc. The other way to view the Palestinian struggle, which, as I mentioned, as socialists and as internationalists should view it as, is through a materialist lens. That means employing a different set of tools, which involve understanding this history through an understanding of, like you mentioned, settler colonialism and Zionism and the Zionist project. And within that, the different methods of control and economic and political and social domination, including apartheid. Um, we need to understand the specific formation of Zionism in the 19th century as a colonial ideology that aligned itself with imperialism to achieve colonial goals. Um, Palestine in the early 20th century, before the bloody creation of the State of Israel, was under British mandate. And then Britain began to facilitate for Zionist settlers to move through the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And even in that period from 1917 to 1948, a period that is erased from history, we see there was a robust Palestinian struggle against British imperialism of the time. Um, yeah, so the arguments, the idealist arguments, only managed to obfuscate the struggle and really make it seem as if it's a historical issue uh, that doesn't have any frameworks through which we can analyze it. Um, but yeah, and through that lens, we can see we're able to move through Palestinian history all the way through to today, understanding the Zionist state as an imperialist outpost in the Middle East, facilitating US interests in the region, and seeing the Palestinian struggle as part of a third world movement to achieve liberation in the name of socialism, not in the name of culture and religion. Um, Obviously, in the name of socialism is kind of the ultimate, idealist hope.
Yeah, and I mean, as we know, US has its hand in almost every ongoing conflict across the world, I think, and US and UK, and um, it's just for me, it's just reading the news every day, just sort of confronted by another, imperialist attack by one of the global north countries on the global south. I think, like you've rightly said, it is in their interest to sort of take away the sovereignty of the global south states. And one of the things, like, because you've mentioned the role of the leftists and the internationalists in our world today, I've recently read your profile, like Mike Davis, something I've told you, and I really, really enjoyed reading it. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you on this interview was the part where you highlight how Mike Davis fused intellectual rigor with practical activism, all the while centering the working class and the marginalized communities. And I wanted to know from you if you could elaborate for our readers, just a little bit about his unbounded approach to writing and activism that you've sort of felt as you've engaged with his work, and how he challenged conventional orthodoxies, but also contributed to a deeper understanding of internationalism along the way.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was one of my favorite pieces to write, actually, in honor of the late Mike Davis. Um, I first encountered Mike Davis, and actually, I first read Mike Davis in an international law class in my undergrad. Um, I read the piece that the book that I read was Late Victorian Holocausts, and I remember being struck by it because it was a distinct understanding of global poverty and ecological disaster that I don't recall ever reading any viewpoint like this. I remember specifically being struck by his explanation that natural disasters like famines aren't so much natural as they are the consequences of global capital accumulation through colonialism and through imperialist expansion. um, and in that way Davis was able to frame millions of deaths as avoidable rather than inevitable political tragedies, um, which is obviously interesting to think about. You can apply the same framework to deaths that happened as a result of COVID, that were because of political decisions made by global elites. It's also, we were talking about Palestine now, we're seeing people frame it as a humanitarian crisis when, as if it's like caused by an earthquake and so on and so forth. But it's not. It is because of political decisions made by, um, empire. Um, and yeah, arguably, Mike Davis is one of the most important Marxist thinkers of the past century, and I'm drawn to him. I was drawn to him because of his internationalism, precisely. And you could see that through his writing that he was not trained in the academy. Um, his formative political experiences came through, organizing that he was exposed to while working as a truck driver. He was part of the US Communist Party. Um, and he was most importantly, an unapologetic anti-imperialist. He was active in the anti-war movement in the US and was always thinking through the effects of US imperialism abroad rather than focusing on domestic struggles only, which is my main problem with a lot of the socialist thinkers we see today, that they favor socialist policies that will help them in the imperial core and the global north without thinking about its effects on the global south. Um, he adopted slogans that are like US out now and forever, and he always showed his deep-seated internationalism and solidarity with victims of the US war machines. And you mentioned that I wrote that he was unbounded. And like I said, that is related to him being, self-trained, not trained in the academy, not like um, not restricted by disciplines that we see, like we see in universities. Sociology is its own discipline, anthropology is its own discipline, etc., etc. But he had this true unboundedness that was, interdisciplinary, and he took those orthodoxies and defined them in his own way and seamlessly tied them all together. And through his writing, if you read several of his works, you understand how, being a tenant in LA can be tied to being a slum dweller in Manila and all of these global interconnectedness. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I could be wrong, but it was also one of Mike Davis's writing, which I think when I was studying in college, sort of put into perspective for us how Churchill caused one of the Bengal famines in India, and how it was not, as you said, a natural disaster, but because of his policies to direct all of the food produced in India towards the war that was happening in Europe.
Mhm.
And that really opened my eyes up in a way, because we'd been studying critiques of Churchill in school, in college, but no one had ever sort of put into perspectives something that happened at such a large scale in India, which in many ways scholars also say that a lot of people in India are diabetic because of this famine, because of the way the bodies have evolved ever since. But yeah, it was really eye opening, and yeah, and thank you for writing that profile. I think it also sort of put into perspective a lot of his works and a lot of his ideologies and his legacies. um, it put everything back for me to sort of remind me that you don't really necessarily need to come from a certain pedigree in order to access all of this, you know, interdisciplinary knowledge. So, yeah.
Exactly.
And just to round up our discussion today, which has been really amazing so far, I just wanted to talk a little bit about your music, which I found so fascinating. And just to put in context for our readers, you are a resident selector at NTS, and your music has influences from the MENA region, and I think even beyond. It's really collaborative, also, I would say. And, for me, I think music can hold a unique capacity to challenge preconceived notions and, foster global connections amongst artists. But I wanted to ask you if you would agree that, music can be a bridge between different cultures in a way, and contribute to creation of shared spaces for artists to not just create music for enjoyment, but also to create music for raising their voices against global powers, and in that way also connect with each other across borders and collaborate.
Yeah, thank you for that very kind, for these very kind words. I think calling it my music is very generous. I'm merely, as you said, a selector. And like, funny story about that. So I wasn't trying to become a DJ at all. Like, it wasn't something I was trying to do, but I was born and raised in Cairo until I moved here to here, meaning London, 4 years ago. So I was always, you know, going to like underground parties in Cairo or like underground gigs, and um, Egypt now and Palestine and other countries in the Middle East have quite a robust and like budding music scene. In Egypt specifically, it's one of the only places out, because there's not really a political sphere, but like there is a budding like music and art and culture scene. So yeah, I was just in London at a dinner party or a house party, I don't remember. And I was the one that was in control of the music. So I was just playing the music that I normally listen to and that I listen to in Cairo from, Egyptian drum and bass to Palestinian rap and hip hop. And then, people really liked it. And obviously, people here have this idea that like Middle Eastern music is a certain type of way. It's like kind of like poppy wedding music or something. And this is really like experimental Middle Eastern music that is like from the underground. So someone said, hey, like you should definitely message my friend at NTS. They'd love to have you on, I'm sure. And so then I email NTS and they were like, come do a live show. So I had to learn how to DJ like 4 days before my NTS show. And then since like I had one, and since then I've been getting booked as a DJ. So I've kind of had to learn as I was doing it. And then they gave me a residency there. And it is like, for me, it is a form of expression, um, like writing. And it's good to have a hobby that isn't reading and writing, something to with your hands. And I feel like I've always, um, not to be annoying, but I feel like I've always had like a good music taste, and I know how to make a playlist, and I know like which, or like I know how to curate and how to like tell a story in that way. Um, and yeah, I think what makes the show interesting in that is that it shows all of those organic links between artists in the Middle East. Like you'd see Egyptian artists producing to Palestinian artists. You see Lebanese artists on the tracks of like Egyptian artists, etc., etc., and that's very natural. It's not forced. Like there's similar, cultural underpinnings. It's the same language, and it's not political per se, but you could see it's political by virtue of experience. Like for example, when you see Palestinian hip hop, the artists are not trying to be political. It's just their experience when they speak about daily life and like the West Bank. When the lyrics are about that, then it's obviously political in its own way, just this daily experience of being Palestinian. Uh, Same in Egypt, like Egyptian hip hop and Egyptian Maharaganat music played a role um, in the Egyptian revolution, in its own way. And we've seen how the Egyptian music syndicate has tried to clamp down on um, specific genres and specific artists. So I'm not really trying to have like trying to make a big political message with my selections, but it's just by default, this is the story of how these musicians came to be. And obviously, like, not everything is political. A lot of the stuff I play, like, Egyptian drum and bass, like trendy, like electronic music and stuff, is really interesting in its own way because it doesn't follow the formula of what you think a Middle Eastern song would be, and it is as competitive as, and like even more interesting than like trendy German techno. So yeah, this is why I have a show at NTS.
But I mean, it's not really easy, I think, to put together a playlist that well. I mean, I can't do it for sure. And I'm sure it wasn't easy to learn how to DJ in 4 days. I think that's quite a feat. But
And
what you say is,
yeah, what's
sorry?
interesting now is that I've formed a lot of like new friendships with musicians around the Middle East and beyond, and who send me their new stuff, send me unreleased songs, and so on and so forth. So I'm really happy about that.
Yeah, and we see that confluence. I mean, in
Mhm.
the tracks that I listen to, I definitely vibed with it. I would say so. I mean, if you ever want to share your playlist, you should feel free to send it to me one day.
I will.
I'll
I will
definitely.
do. And all of my shows are archived on NTS Radio and on SoundCloud. Yeah.
Amazing. I hope our readers rush to NTS and listen to your tracks.
Thank you.
But this whole discussion has been really amazing, and thank you again for joining us, making time, and sharing your perspective so honestly, so freely with all of us.
Thank you for having me. This has been really enjoyable for me as well.
I'm glad to hear it. But before we part ways, I'd like to take a moment to invite our readers to share the Internationalist with their friends. By sharing and spreading the word, you enable us to produce more engaging interviews like this one, as well as help and build, sustain our progressive international. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.